Manila. Kyushu, one of the main Japanese islands, was handed another terrific pasting by our super fortresses today. All of our B-29s came home.
The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War.
I'm Cheryl Cox, mayor of the city of Chula Vista. Welcome to Chula Vista's Spirit of 45, a documentary that captures memories from the day World War II ended, August 14th, 1945. This is an opportunity to commemorate those in our community who lived and served during the battles in Europe and the Pacific. From them, we will learn of their many sacrifices and the unwavering commitment to service that helped defend democracy and build our nation and our community here at home. Americans of this era truly were the greatest generation. Now you will hear and see stories and images of local veterans as they recall the moment 65 years ago when they heard the news, the war is over. I have the honor to start this program with the story of Joan de Munbrun, one of the many across the nation that are being shared today in an effort to encourage America's youth to engage with our mothers, fathers, grandparents, great-grandparents, and our veterans to learn about the spirit of service that united our nation during difficult years as we keep the spirit of 45 alive.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War. The United Nations on land.
3 years, 8 months, 25 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the long war was over.
The story of Joan de Munbrun. On August 14, 1945, I was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado as part of the Women's Army Corps attached to the Air Corps. We consisted of several thousand personnel. I was an instructor for operating and maintaining aerial cameras. We were aware of stepped-up activity and were always on alert, but this was different. As I recall, someday around midday, I heard the sounds of screams, "It's over!" and personnel started running from the base. I was stunned. Then I thought of my first assignment in Eagle Pass, Texas, Army AT-6 Flying School. As a photographer, I photographed the 18-year-old cadets coming in the field. I also photographed crashes where we were ordered to take photos of the serial numbers of the planes and send them to Washington. I would then go to the lab and pull the negatives of the cadet who had become the casualty and make an enlargement of it for the family. I realized that the boys were not coming back home. The women had signed up for the duration of the war plus 6 months. Having been on the bases for 3 years and never having been out of uniform, I realized now I would be going home. When I enlisted, I was living in a hotel, so I didn't know where home would be. All I knew was that the Army would pay for my trip back to Minneapolis, and on Thanksgiving Day, 1945, I was discharged and returned to Minneapolis. I spent 30 days planning on my future and decided to attend the Fred Archer School of Photography in Los Angeles, a 2-year program which had been established for the returning veterans. From that time on, my life has been with the veterans and of service to veteran causes.
I'm Neil Asper, Administrator of California Veterans Home, Chula Vista. August 14, 2010 is the 65th anniversary of VJ Day. The spirit of 45 is reflected in the veterans' stories of service for their country and their community. The story of Jean Pellerin. August 14, 1945 started as any other day. The marching of the Army and the flying of the B-12s had become the alarm clock to a young 10-year-old living in St. Petersburg, Florida. Life at this point in time had been engulfed by all the war efforts. To a boy much too young to understand the state in which the world was in, The only thing he understood was the constant news of war that were a part of his daily life, the post-war rations that provided his family with food, and the emotions felt by his parents whenever the war was mentioned. It seemed to him that this war had strained the country for such a long time, and that there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Gene Pellerin was home with his parents, listening to the radio in the same way he had done for as long as he could remember. As the family listened, his father's face changed in expression. His mother stopped cleaning the house, and he felt a sense of excitement with so much emotion in the room. As the words on the radio said, "Japan has surrendered," it seemed as if a huge weight had been lifted. Was it possible that the war, which had brought so much suffering, economic frustration, and most importantly the cost of innocent lives, had ended? The Pellerin family ran outside. It was a day of celebration. The children screamed in joy of the knowledge that the war was over. Parents cried in relief that their children were coming home, and the country, for a moment in history, united for a single purpose, to celebrate the end of the war. Later, Gene joined the Navy, became a captain, and served his country for 28 years. He volunteers as a member of the Chula Vista Veterans Home Support Foundation and as a member of the Chula Vista Veterans Commission.
My name is Paul Thompson. I was in the Navy back in 1945 and World War II. I was an aviation ordnanceman, third class, on the aircraft carrier USS Monterey. But I remember that it was announced over our ship's loudspeaker that the World War II was over because the Emperor of Japan had pleaded for peace. And then a few weeks later, the battleship Missouri went into the Tokyo Bay along with General MacArthur and some of our fleet admirals and so on, and had the big ceremony that became world famous about the final episode of World War II.
I'm Harry Greenberg. I was in the Army Air Corps. I first heard about the war after a trip that I made to Enid, Oklahoma. We were visiting friends there. And there was a new base opened up in Enid. That's the first time I ever saw a military base. I was in high school. And when we got back to our home, I lived near Tulsa in a little town called Sapulpa. And my uncle, who was living with us, said, "We're at war."
Mr. Greenberg was sent overseas to Europe in the Army of Occupation. He used the first groundbreaking radar that helped map air traffic and airplanes' positions. The site in which he worked was a destroyed V-2 rocket base in which the future of technology was building. On August 14, 1945, as Mr. Greenberg and 60,000 other men heard the news on the radio that the war was over, there was static energy throughout the camp. The image that is vivid in Mr. Greenberg's mind is one of so many young men that had had so much fear and had worked so hard for such a long time, finally having the opportunity to celebrate their efforts. 60,000 men running down the flight strip is an image to see. Happy, that's what we were, Mr. Greenberg said.
My name is Shirley Cornegay, and I was in the Marine Corps.
The story of Shirley Cornegay. Shirley Cornegay was born on January 28, 1923, into a family of hardworking people in Chicago, Illinois. During the Great Depression, they were haunted by no job prospects, little food, and fear of cold every night. Shirley had a boyfriend, Frank, who she was going to marry once she turned 18. 1 month before her 18th birthday, her fiancé was killed in an accident. This tragic event prompted Shirley to enlist in the Marine Corps on February 13, 1941. That fall, she was sent to New River, North Carolina on a troop train. After 40 days of training, she became a full-fledged Marine. Trained to drive a 5 or 10-ton truck, she drove to San Diego, where she met a Marine, Kenneth Cornegay, at their graduation. Shirley remembers waiting for a bus in front of what is now Horton Plaza, seeing sailors jumping and screaming to everyone that the war was over.
I would like to see all young ladies go into the service because it's not only good training, but it teaches you things that you never would think of. Because the average person, when they graduate from school, they're in a small little world. They go to work in an office and, that's it. But in the Marine Corps, they not only send you places that you've never been, but you're with such a wide assortment of people that you learn to get along with everybody. And on top of that, it's fun.
Charles Sizemore. I was 19 years old and stationed aboard the USS Tripoli off the East Coast searching for gun submarines. We saw 3 or 4 squads with 5 or 6 planes per squad fly over us on the way to Japan. We didn't know it at the time, but they were on their way to drop the bomb. On August 14th, we were watching a movie on the carrier when they stopped the movie and announced the war was over. We all started hollering and jumping up and down on the hangar deck, and I was jumping and shooting right along with everyone else. It was a good feeling to hear the war was over. We knew we were going home. I arrived home on November 18th, and my older brother returned home on November 19th. There were 4 of us in the service, and I lost 1 brother. My brother-in-law served with Patton. Patton didn't say go and do it. He said follow me. He was out there with the soldiers.
What I remember most is I was in Hawaii, and as soon as they dropped the bomb, they rushed me to Iwo Jima, and from Iwo Jima I was transferred to the Missouri. And I was only there for 3 days, and I was there in case I was needed, and I was not needed for any interpreting.
My name is Richard Bartlett, and I called my mother one day, and she said, "Oh, you got a draft notice." And I said, "Well, how can it be? I'm up here." And I said, "Well," about a week later, I said, "Okay, I'll go back down and see what they wanted." So I came back to San Diego, and I went up and got in the Army. I always believed that I would, if I get into combat, I want to know as much as I can about, so I can try and come out of it alive. And then later in life, I used to go to the Norman Park Senior Center and helped them out there. I was the president of that for 2 years.
James Dibble, the U.S. Army, 76th Division, and our division was in reserve for the Battle of the Bulge. After the war was over, I remained in the European theater as an MP, and I was stationed in Le Mans, France, and from there I went to Namur, Belgium as an MP. And we were very grateful and relieved that it was over. The biggest relief was we had gotten a rumor that we were going to have to stay there and fight the Russians. So that's why we were very relieved to hear that it was over and we'd be going home. I signed up for the GI Bill and took a training course on machine shop tool and die, and that was my profession until I retired. It made life more precious, not knowing how much longer we had to live or not knowing what our future was. It's a learning experience besides defending a country and preserving the freedom that we cherish.
My name is Mary Jane Delphinick. I was in the service as Mary Jane Davis, and I was United States Navy Wave. And I remember going outside afterwards and looking up at the moon, and I can see it had a ring around it. It was beautiful. But they found out in the raspberry field, and everybody was all excited, and they stopped picking raspberries that day.
The story of Ruth Adams. Because of the war, Ruth Adams decided to start nurse training with her twin sister as a way to support her country. Men had been hurt, and she decided to do something greater with her life.
Ms. Adams was sent to Germany to help those men wounded during the war. Every day she saw soldiers wounded. She knew her responsibility as a first lieutenant, and she would not stop working as long as she could save a life. She could not feel, she could not break. She just had to keep going, even if her muscles cramped or her eyes would close. She was on the front line, on a battle with death, and she knew she had to win. Her first and only day off in the whole year was Christmas. She did not mind and she did not care, because her only will to keep her going was that she was helping those men and that she was bringing someone's boy back home. When the August 14, 1945 announcement came, "It's official, Pacific War ends," the return to peace summed up everything Ruth had felt. She no longer had to say goodbye to those men she could not save, and she knew that all the efforts had counted because the war was over. It was a day of celebration, a day of excitement throughout the train. Everywhere the news ran to Ruth. They were on the tracks toward peace.
Then they decided to send us to the Pacific, and we were on a troop train going from Germany to Marseille, and the headlines came out that the war was over. So then we stayed in Marseille a short time, and then they sent us back up into Germany to finish out our time.
So there were a bunch of nurses.
Everything went at such a fast pace that you really didn't have time to be homesick or scared or anything. And we were young, and everything was going according to toil. I've done a lot of volunteer. I do blood pressures every Monday, twice here and twice at the community center. I've worked with the food bank. I've helped with health fairs, and I worked till I was 75.
I'm Herman Frankel, and I was in the Army Air Force. And when I was overseas, I was in the Air Force Command.
The story of Herman Frankel. As an only child willing to risk the family's inheritance to serve his country, Herman Frankel was able to serve his country only because a family doctor placed him in limited service. Mr. Frankel, at the age of 22, joined the Navy because that is what he believed he had to do when his country was calling for help. After training, Mr. Frankel was sent to Iceland to help fuel the airplanes that came into the incredible 500-plane capacity base, and also he was a part of the crash team. One morning, a B-17 came down the strip with a wing full of fuel on fire.
And we had to be there when the plane came in. We had to be there when the plane left. We had to be there when they gassed up. And this plane come in with a wing on fire, and we were there with the truck, with the crash truck. And so my sergeant says to me, you got to get up on that wing and put that fire out. So he put a ladder up to the wing, and I went up on the wing and stuck the hose through the fuselage into the wing and flooded the wing with water, and we put the fire out. And so I didn't know it, and I didn't know anything. I didn't hear anything more about it. And finally, when I was discharged and I come home here, my father had a letter of commendation, and he had been passing it around so much the darn thing was worn out from opening and folding it. And I didn't even know I had this commendation, letter of commendation. It had all these colonels signing it, and the way I remember that Harry Truman had his name on there too. But today, I have it today, but it's so disintegrated that there's hardly anything you can read on it. And there had been 5 men in the crash crew, and they all had their names on there. August the 14th, 1945, I was in the Quonset hut with all the fellas in there, all hollering and cheering that Japan had surrendered. I was so happy that the war was over. All I wanted to do was go home.
My name is Colin Shadell, and I was in the United States Navy. I was 17 years old and still in high school when I joined. I was in Chicago at the time. Well, I was still stationed at Glenview, Illinois. And when we heard about the end of the war, several of us went into town in Chicago to celebrate. And it was real pandemonium in Chicago at that time. People celebrating, doing all kinds of things. After I retired and went to Watsonville, California, and I was a manager of a department store there, and I did some community service there. I was a literacy tutor.